Good morning. Welcome to the Church Communications Podcast. I'm Katie Allred, and this is my friend Josh Taylor.
Good morning.
And today we're discussing how to avoid the curse of knowledge. So Josh wrote a really great blog post that we just published this morning on our blog about 5 ways your church can give guests with kids a better experience. So we're going to talk about that. But first, we have to address the man in the room.
This is John Bunyan, not Paul Bunyan.
But John Bunyan. They could be related.
Axe. They could be, but this is John Bunyan.
Somebody find out if the theologian John Bunyan is related to the Paul Bunyan.
But John Bunyan wrote Pilgrim's Progress. Great book. Everybody should read it.
Yeah.
That was the mystery, last time. So John Bunyan is going to join us this morning on our podcast.
Okay. So now that we've addressed the elephant in the room, or the theologian in the room, let's talk about the curse of knowledge. So, Josh, I will not lie, I'm not totally familiar with the concept of the curse of knowledge. So why don't you fill us in?
You may be more familiar with it than you think you are, because all of us suffer from it, especially church staffs. The issue that we have with the curse of knowledge is that we are so familiar with our organization. In churches, we're so familiar with our facilities that we assume people know things that they don't actually know simply because we're so familiar with it. So the biggest thing that we'll talk about today would be our facilities. When people come into the parking lot, we assume it's easy to navigate, but it's really not when people are in a completely unfamiliar place. And so we don't see the things that our guests often see.
So what can we do to make let's start from the outside and work our way into the building. Okay. So what can we do? Okay. So there's a person coming to visit us. They've decided to come to church for the first time, which is probably a scary decision anyway. What can we do to make this less awkward and scary and make it more, clear?
So I was consulting with a church in Seattle a few months ago, and
You're so fancy.
I know. And one of the issues that they had, and this was one of the first problems that we addressed with them, was they have a building that doesn't really look like a traditional looking church.
Okay.
But they're also surrounded by a lot of trees. It's a beautiful area, lots of huge Christmas trees everywhere. But it was really easy to miss their entrance. In fact, I missed their entrance coming in.
Oh, wow.
Had to go turn around and back up, and still had a hard time finding their entrance. And so one of the things that they needed to work on was not cut down all the trees or change their building, because I like the way that they're building. It was a really cool looking building, but they need to make their signage more obvious and make the entrance into their parking lot more obvious, because it was really hard to find.
What do you think about, so if you have multiple entrances, should you designate one clear entrance, or should you just have greeters at every possible entrance? Like, what do you think is the best?
Well, for security issues, I wouldn't have too many entrances, but I would narrow it down to the priority entrances and make them very obvious, and obviously put people there.
Yeah.
You probably, if you have a lot of entrances, you probably don't have the staff to really have everybody there.
Right.
But they would probably all lead to the same place eventually.
Right.
But in some of those non-main entrances, make sure you at least have signage there.
Yeah. So first-time guests, are you a big fan of the first-time guest parking, like singling them out, or would you rather them just park like a normal person and come in?
I'm not as concerned about first-time guest parking, because I don't think guests care that much about that, but I am concerned about parents having at least knowing where
designation
to park.
About children.
Yeah. So my wife and I, for the last several months, have been visiting other churches, since I'm not full-time staff on a church anymore. And that's one of the biggest issues that we found. One church we visited, it was pouring down rain. They actually have a separate entrance for their children's area, which is nice.
And you went in the wrong one, though.
We went in the wrong one. One, because there was no parking there, because they're doing two, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but they're doing two different services, so there's no parking spots available.
Yeah.
And there was no signage that was the children's area.
Yeah.
The only reason I knew it was the children's area is because I'd been to the church years ago, but we couldn't park over there. And I assumed it was still the children's area. There was no signage telling me that it was. So we had to walk with our 3-year-old in pouring down rain from the back of the parking lot, and still went in the wrong place.
Yeah, that's not the experience that we want to give people.
I don't think guests, obviously you want a handicap parking spot. You want a place for elderly people to make it easier for them. But guests with kids, give them a special place to park, or at least tell them where to park if there's a special entrance.
Maybe like, and like, you're like, okay, we'll tell them, like, of course you would hopefully have parking attendants and that kind of stuff that could help.
There was no parking attendants in this one.
But if they didn't have it, then maybe put it clearly on the internet.
Yeah,
Because
that's great.
because you probably looked at their website, read
Mhm.
about when the times were and stuff.
Yep.
Like maybe directly underneath that times have like more information or something like
Mhm.
that. Like have a button that can take you to a page that gives you like this full in depth. And so a lot of people not only are looking for information about where to drop off their kids, but they're also looking for information for what do I wear on Sunday.
Yeah, that's actually the number one thing
The
that people
number
want to
one
see on
thing that
church
people
websites.
like, that's why they're coming to look. They're looking at your website's pictures because they want to know, is your church, contemporary, or is it I need to dress up this Sunday, which is fine. I don't think anybody cares
Mhm.
if it's one way or the other. They just want to know what to expect.
Yep.
So if you would maybe make, so of course, I think your times and directions need to be the clearest thing on the homepage of your website. And I think you also need to put it in the footer of your website because every time I drag down to the bottom, I just want to find out this information quickly.
Mhm.
I think it needs to be in the footer. Times and directions need to be in the footer.
Yeah.
But on
Or at
top of
least a
that,
clickable address that they can click
yeah,
on their phone.
yeah. But there should be another button, another link or something that says what to expect.
Mhm.
And then that page explains information about what to do with my children.
Yep.
And then maybe something about what to wear.
Yep.
And then you can give them information about
Mhm.
Sunday school or life groups or whatever on top of
Yeah,
it.
one of the things that we talk about a lot is passing the grunt test. So your signage in your parking lot should be able to pass the grunt test,
Right.
which means people can clearly look at it and know immediately this is where I need to go.
Right.
The church in Seattle, once I got into the parking lot, I had no idea where the entrance to their
church was.
to their worship center was. And so
Yeah.
I parked in the wrong parking lot, and it was really cold. It was in Seattle. It was a cold front that came
And you had
through.
to walk a lot.
I had to walk all the way around, which was fine. It was just me, but man, if my 3-year-old was with me,
Right. It'd
it'd
have been the
frustrating.
end of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I would have dragged him. But so make your signage big, make it clear, make it obvious. Let it pass the grunt test. Don't assume people know where to go. Just assume that people don't know anything, and you need to tell them everything.
Okay, so past signage.
Yeah.
Let's talk about like timing, right? So,
Yes.
As church leaders, we're talking about the curse of knowledge again. So the curse of knowledge is when we don't realize that people don't know where they're going. So signage is a problem, that we need to put better signage, or we need to clearly communicate on our website about what to expect. But then two, we need to have better times.
Yes. So the multi-service gatherings are becoming more
very
and more
popular.
popular.
Yes.
It saves us a lot of money, a lot of resources to be able to do this.
Right. And it's safer, I think, too.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, it can be safer. We don't have to renovate and create new facilities and these kind of things. But one of the problems that it does create is, how do we time it? And a lot of us are only putting like 30 or 45 minutes between the two services.
Right.
And for many of our churches, that's not enough time to get people out of the parking lot.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to get people out of your building, but to get people out of your building and out of your parking lot without creating traffic jams, without it being unsafe, but also so that your guests coming into the second service actually have a place to park, because your first service is already filling up all of the parking lots.
Yeah.
And especially guests with kids, they're going to come early because they don't know the check-in process.
Right. I think too, going back to parking attendants, right? So if your church doesn't have parking attendants, it's harder to get people moving, I think, because they're not expecting someone to, like, I don't know, not wave them down, but I feel like when people are standing around, like, helping, they get the understanding that they need to move it.
Yeah.
So, of course, having more parking, if that's possible, is good, but maybe having parking attendants if you don't have that, so that the flow of traffic is good, so that people are safe too, because people are moving out of there in a hurry, and there are children. So having a parking attendant is just like a good idea all around, but also having enough time between the services where we can flip the parking lot.
Yeah.
Not just flip, the stage. I think a lot of people just think about what's going on inside the sanctuary, but you got to think about what's going on outside in your parking lot. A lot of stuff is going down. So
it's exciting to see a full parking lot when you drive up. So you're not awkward like you're the only one, but it's really frustrating when there are no parking spots because everybody in the first service is still in there. They're still talking.
Yeah, so give them some time to like fellowship and get out of there. But don't just think, oh, it's just about what's going on inside. You got to think about the outside.
And every church is going to be different. There's not one answer for this.
I
you
can't just say 30 minutes is perfect.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it may
depends
not be
on the
for
size
you.
of your church, depends on the size of your parking spot. I think the national average when I looked last time as we were creating a new facility was like 1.7 or 2.7 people per car. I'm not sure what that 0.7 is.
Half a person exists.
So when you
Three-quarters
go
of a
out,
person exists.
when you go out and count your parking spots, count it as, figure out what that is. And it's going to be different on different demographics of cities as well.
Okay, so we're going to flip back over here to kids ministry again and just talk about like having a simple check-in process if you do have children.
Yeah. So this has been the biggest issue that my wife and I have faced over the last several months. Probably the most frustrating at almost every church that we have visited is they have very similar check-in processes that I'm used to, but it also allowed me to kind of see the holes in the check-in processes that I created as well. Because you come in, we've got a 3-year-old that has a ton of energy. He has 2 speeds, it's asleep and full blast. And so when we walk into a children's ministry area, there's a lot of exciting things for him to see. He gets really excited about things. And so it's hard to keep him still, but then they hand us this form that's really long for us to fill out.
Right.
So before we can do anything, we have to fill out this form, and then they have to put us into the computer and get all this stuff set up. And it can take up to 10 minutes. Trying to keep a 3-year-old
entertained,
not just entertained, but next to you and safe and in your eyesight while you're doing all of this, especially if you're a single parent, can be really difficult, and it's really frustrating. And by the time they get the kid dropped off and into the worship center, they need Jesus.
Especially if they're like filling out, well, maybe that's where you want them to be. I don't know, but especially if you're having them fill out like 20 questions.
Yeah.
I mean, it shouldn't be.
Just ask the questions that need to know to keep the kids safe.
Yes, very necessary questions. Like I would say, like name, email, not even email, maybe just phone number.
Whatever you need to get in touch with the parent during the service.
Right.
If you want to do an email, it's a great way to collect email addresses. But I would say, keep it down to 1 page for sure, and just 5 or 6 questions. If there's somebody else that's going to be picking them up.
Dietary.
If there's allergy issues.
There's an allergy,
just keep it as simple as possible.
Right.
And think about the parent, the single parent that has a very energetic kid. Will they be able to do this and keep their kids still? Right. Another bonus points, and this was bonus points for us because one church that we visited did this for us, and it was huge for us. They actually had a volunteer come around and entertain our child while we were doing
the dang
process. So it was really cool. It goes a long way with parents. We loved it. It helps break the ice with the kids. I love that too.
Yeah.
And just have somebody that's really willing to be silly. That's willing to be, don't dress them up as a clown or something that's going to be scary to some kids, but just let them be silly and step out of the box.
Come over and, hang out with them for just a second.
That goes a long way with the kids and with the parents.
Yeah. And too, I like you mentioned in this blog post, you mentioned about having a downloaded form from the website. So, we talked about this what to expect page. Maybe you could put a form of, we want to get to know you, and this will make your check-in process easy. Will you go ahead and download this form or do a form online? Just do an online form.
Yeah.
And so they can know what to expect. Of course, we've talked about plan a visit forms several times on this podcast in the past. So maybe you do a plan a visit form, and on that plan a visit form, you have something about checking in your children, and you already got all that information, and you can send it to your children's ministry so that they know that this child is coming, and they already have it in the database, and they can just check in the child like a normal Sunday.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people might not do that, but some will. And so at the very least, I would simplify your check-in process as best as you could. And then if there's 2 different places for different ages to check in, make sure that signage is really clear as well. Because, I would try to move everything to one place, but if you can't, some people can't, just make the signage really clear.
Yeah. All right. So we have talked about signage. Maybe what to expect, plan a visit, all those kind of things on your website. We've also talked about well-timed gatherings, giving people not just enough time inside to flip your sanctuary, but also give them enough time to flip your parking lot. We talked about doing a simple check-in process. Next, we're going to talk about security. All right.
Yeah. And I think we all know this, especially parents want to know that their kids are going to be safe while they're in there. So there are a couple of churches that we visited that didn't have any security measures set up. We were basically at the mercy of a children's person watching our kid that we didn't know. And so and that actually concerned my wife, and she was actually, she said during the entire service, she couldn't stop thinking about that.
Right.
And maybe that's overreaction or not, but the reality is that's where parents are today.
Sure.
And so we want to let our parents know, one, we have security measures in place, and let them know where to pick up their child if there is
an emergency.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's really clear too. Always communicating that expectation, especially to new time first guests, like or first time guests. Like I think too, the larger the church, the more that plan needs to be well known
Yeah.
and thought out.
Mhm.
So whatever that plan is, it needs to be communicated every time to
Yeah.
a first time guest what it is.
Absolutely. You know, most of us are not going to experience the shooter situation, but there are
There are
unfortunately
times
people
when
that
that is
will.
going to happen.
But
Yeah.
the biggest issue that we're going to deal with are fires,
Mhm.
or you know, just say health emergencies or whatever it might be. Somebody's having a heart attack or whatever it might be. So
Right.
just let people know what happens in
What to
case of
expect.
emergency. That goes along with parents as well,
Mhm.
letting them know that you have a plan,
Yeah.
and that relieves their fears a lot.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And so the last thing we're going to talk about is remembering your guest information, which may be the hardest thing. I have the hardest time just remembering my students' names.
Yeah. Well, and what I mean by remembering your guest information is when you put them into the check-in process, whether you're using Planning Center or CCB or whatever your check-in process might be, make sure that you can at least save them as a guest. So the next time that they come, they don't have to go through the process again, because that's super unwelcoming. And it feels like, okay, we just did this. Now I have to do this process again. And it makes me feel more disconnected from a community I'm trying to find.
Right.
The reality is they're going to come visit your church. If they're a guest, they're going to come
Mhm.
visit your church, and you may not see them for a few weeks because they're still visiting other churches.
Right.
We've had to do this at a couple of churches where we've had to go through the process at one church like 3 or 4 times.
Mhm.
And it's just really frustrating, especially when the process takes a little while too.
Right.
So remember them, save them at least as a guest in your system so that they don't have to go through the process again.
Right. I completely agree with that. All right. So the curse of knowledge. Anything else?
Yeah, don't assume people know where to go at different places. So like for me, when we drop our kids off at some of the churches, we don't know how to get to the worship center from the children's area.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we could talk about this all day.
Yeah, we could. There's so many different places. If the coffee's free, let people know it's free, because there's
Right.
nothing more awkward than
Like
can I
wondering if I
take
can
it?
get this or
Like
not.
some people are not even going to go over to your coffee because they're not sure if it's free or not.
Free
They
or
don't want to
not.
have that awkward conversation.
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even things as simple as that, for most churches, I think you should serve free coffee because it's a great icebreaker
Right.
for people. So serve,
Because they stand around and
exactly. So
drink it.
serve free community coffee.
Yeah. What else? I'm trying to think. I had one more and I just lost it.
Yeah, there maybe I'll do a blog post just on the curse of knowledge in general with the church, because there's so many different things that we can do. But
Right.
just don't assume that people know what to do.
Right. Especially if they've been unchurched their whole life. Right. Like if they're a seeker or skeptic, like if they haven't ever walked
Mhm.
in a church in their life, like they're not going to know what to do or how to act.
Yep.
So like, just trying to make it as clear, and also like terminology. That was the thought that I was going to have. So, at the church I served previously, we missions and discipleship was like 2 different worlds. And like, but to a person who has just become a believer, they're one and the same thing.
Yeah.
Missions and discipleship don't exist outside of each other.
Right.
You are a Christian and you do both things.
Mhm.
So but trying to figure out that terminology and like the differences and that kind of stuff, how your church maybe operates internally shouldn't affect how a person grows as a Christian.
Right.
So just working on that kind of stuff, I
Yep.
think is really important.
Yeah, don't assume people know how to sign up for events. Don't assume people know how to give
Right.
to your church, especially if you don't pass an offering plate. If
Right.
you use a joy box or something like that, let people know, one, what the joy box is and where it's located. And look over your website and do the same thing. Do we have the curse of knowledge even on our website? Do we assume that people know what these things are?
Right.
And just make sure everything passes the grunt test.
Yeah. All right. So thank you for joining us on the Church Communications Podcast. You can subscribe to this on iTunes or any place that you get your fine podcast. You can also find this on the Church Communications Facebook group and also on our page. And if you haven't joined the group, come join. And thanks for hanging out today, Josh.
Thanks for our special guest, John Bunyan.
Our special guest, John Bunyan, has been hanging out, theologian in the background. If you're listening to this, you don't know that, but come watch it on the Facebook page and like our Facebook page. All right. Thanks. Appreciate it.